Hello respected viewers, I'm George from Ireland. So in this video I'm commenting on this bomb at Kabul airport and the general situation during the evacuation of Afghanistan. US troops, well all NATO troops were due to withdraw by the 11th of September this year, the 20th anniversary of the World Trade Tower attacks. That's pursuant to an agreement signed between the Trump administration and the Taliban in February 2020. So as the number of NATO troops diminished, the Taliban made major advances because there'd been no NATO troops killed in combat for 18 months, but that's simply because the Taliban weren't attacking them, and until recent weeks they weren't even attacking the Afghan army much either. But anyway, when NATO numbers were very down, the Taliban began to advance with alarming rapidity all over the country, provincial capitals falling like ninepins, and so it was panic stations, the Afghan army, some of whom fled to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and so people who supported the democratically elected government of Afghanistan were gripped by terror. People who'd worked for NATO as interpreters and so forth, mostly trying to get out of the country. Some of them already have. They crowded into Kabul airport. Kabul fell to the Taliban without a fight a week ago, and President Ashraf Ghani, he's fled to the UAE, and his government remains the internationally recognized government of Afghanistan by every country in the world. You know, countries like Russia, China, they still have functioning embassies in Kabul, but they're actually accredited to the official government of Afghanistan, not to the Taliban. But anyway, so over 80,000 people have been evacuated from Kabul airport in the last 10 days. They're mostly citizens of NATO countries or countries like India, but they're also Afghans who worked for the NATO forces and obviously in grave danger of revenge. Now, the Taliban have vowed that they will forgive everyone, there'll be no penalty of any kind for their former foes. However, I wouldn't trust them as far as I could punch them. And for the moment, the Taliban don't appear to be too bad. Kabul has changed hands several times over the past 100 years, and this is by far the most peaceful occasion, I suppose partly because it's been taken over bloodlessly for the moment, although apparently there have been a few people killed on the outskirts of Kabul airport in recent days until this bomb attack, which just now, the initial report says that 13 people have been killed, amongst them 4 US Marines. There are over 6,000 US military personnel at Kabul airport, about 1,000 British, a few hundred from other NATO countries, holding the ring, trying to make it safe and operational so that these mercy flights can carry on. And the UK's got about another 4,000 people on its list trying to get out. Some days the UK managed to get out over 1,000 people. Those left are either British citizens or Afghans who assisted the British Armed Forces. Now the date for this to end was 31st of August, although actually, remember, NATO only agreed to leave by the 11th of September. And the Taliban's refused to extend that. If you stay beyond the deadline, all the bets are off, the ceasefire is over. So Biden is not pressurising the Taliban to extend it, though he could do, because Afghanistan's already been cut off from the world financial system. Western Union won't work there, so no international bank transfers or anything of that nature. If they ever want loans from the IMF, well, that's going to be a problem. But plus, the Taliban are not recognised as the rightful government of Afghanistan. If they want recognition, they better play fair. They've been much better than they used to be. Life is continuing large as normal. Okay, women generally wearing chadors in Kabul, but education for women is continuing there, and in Mazar-e-Sharif, even mixed classes, although then there's this Taliban edict saying women shouldn't work outside the house. So a bit of mixed messages. Anyway, it's not been the rape, pillaging and mass murder that accompanied previous stormings of the city. But obviously, if I was an Afghan, I would be aghast that the Taliban had taken over, and if I'd worked for NATO, I would be in fear of my life. Crossing over to Pakistan might not help you because, of course, Pakistan is a firm friend of the Taliban, always has been. They're out open about it now. There's jubilance in Pakistan about this result, and the Prime Minister Imran Khan said that Afghanistan had cast off the shackles of slavery with the Taliban's victory, even though Taliban terrorists have killed thousands of Pakistani civilians and soldiers over the past 20-odd years. Anyway, so what's the purpose of this terrorist attack at Kabul airport? Well, to kill NATO military personnel. Is it the Taliban? I suppose it is. Well, there's also Islamic State there, which is somewhat enmeshed with the Taliban. Now, the Taliban is better understood as a movement rather than an organisation. It's vociferous. It's divided into factions and clans, mostly from Pashto-speaking people. So the commander of the faithful, he can't really control the Taliban, even if he wants to. They don't wear a uniform. It's not very clear who's in the Taliban and who's not, who's just an armed man, who's just a marauder, might be a brigand without much of an ideology either. So any desire to kill infidels, well, that's obviously a plus for people of that ideology. But there's a risk for the Taliban because NATO could say, okay, all the bets are off. You broke the ceasefire, conflict resumes, we're bombing you. But then that might make life quite hairy for the NATO forces trying to hold the ring at Kabul and get people out. But I was reading in the press minutes before the news of the bomb actually came, that there was intelligence there may well be a bomb attack, and the British Defence Secretary was saying that. So what do? Do you cut your rescue operation short and just fly out your troops right now? Leave those 4,000 odd people the UK is meant to evacuate hanging? Obviously, the US has got more people they wish to evacuate, other NATO countries. Or do you carry on regardless? Some of your people are going to get killed. There isn't an easy option. And how do you prevent this bomb attack happening? Well, the thing is, NATO doesn't control anything beyond the perimeter of the military part of Kabul airport. The Taliban control the rest. If you go out there, the Taliban may say you're breaking the ceasefire. There's complete chaos with tens of thousands of people crowding around the airport. Remember, they've been out in the open for several nights in many cases with minimal food and water, no sanitation. So it's not a good situation. Anyway, I mean, I think that the departure will be preponed because there are probably just going to be more and more such attacks. And remember, what if you're the last plane, the last sort of 100-odd military personnel? Then you're in grave danger of being overwhelmed, your plane shot down as you try and fly out of there. And remember, the Taliban's taken over a lot of military hardware that NATO gave to the Afghan army, who just dropped it when they fled. You know, tanks, armoured personnel carriers, planes. I don't know, do they have artillery? Do they have surface missiles? I'm not sure. I'm no military expert. But Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, he said that the evacuations shall continue. And the British Defence Secretary said, all right, the United Kingdom could carry on its own without the United States doing it, but we're just not going to do it. Well, I have some doubts about that. I mean, the British Army is only 80,000 strong. There have been cutbacks and cutbacks. It's half the number it used to be at the time of Margaret Thatcher, despite the population increasing. And all right, I know technology will do the work of more than one soldier, but even so, the army is very, very small right now. The UK can't guarantee it'll get all the people out who wants to get out. You might try and prioritise British citizens, but they might be in less danger, actually, than Afghans who are pro-NATO. Another thing is, if you're a British person who chose to be in Afghanistan, well, you know it was an extremely dangerous place and a war zone. So I think the government's got a limited responsibility to get you out. You had a responsibility to get yourself out there. And the French, wise enough, they got all their people out in May when the going was good. And there comes a point whereas, you know, there's only so much the government can do to help you. How much money should be spent to save one life? The US military's had helicopter missions to pick people up from remote locations outside the airport. I don't know how they communicated with them. Just go quick, get them, because the Taliban might object to that. And there's a bit of a danger to the US troops. Their helicopter might be shot down. So the Taliban are saying the blast nothing to do with them. These bombs were set off in areas under US control. That's the thing, is someone claiming to be a refugee. Presumably you have to search them, pat them down and see, are you who you say you are? Do you have your passport? Face recognition technology. Of course, they might be afraid to have their passport or any identity documents on them because this could identify the Taliban as someone they want to seek vengeance on. That means stories the Taliban are still started arresting those who served the previous government. So anyway, it's not a good situation. Now, Trump is gleeful about this. This is Trump's plan. Okay, he was crowing about this. He had Mike Pompeo, his defense secretary, meet the Taliban's head honcho. And so all Biden's doing is implementing Trump's plan. I know Biden wasn't obliged to do so. He could have ripped up the deal, which is what Trump does with the previous deals. Where would you have been then? The conflict would have continued indefinitely. And I know Blair says, but the conflict wasn't that bad. No NATO soldier had been killed in 18 months. Yeah, that's because the agreement to pull out is why they hadn't been killed. And actually it wasn't a very high number of NATO soldiers were killed over 20 years, only about 4,000. I hope that doesn't seem callous, but honestly, considering the population of NATO countries, several hundred of millions, that's actually very, very low over 20 years. But we're used to having a soft life and not too many other people killed. I'm not remotely valiant. I'm not putting myself in harm's way. But it was just very expensive, over $2 trillion. I think that's what the US spent alone. So this couldn't go on forever. Something like people in the Labour Party saying, oh, we've got a duty of honour to save these people. So what's your alternative? To stay beyond the 31st of August to renew the conflict? How do you get out then? You then have to take back the whole of Kabul, wait till it's relatively safe, and then fly out. But when it's relatively safe, as soon as you start flying out, it's no longer safe, which is what's just happened. So the situation was untenable. I think this conflict, it was winnable. from NATO's point of view, but that required a much greater commitment, that not 4,000 NATO troops are going to be killed, maybe 40,000, spending more money, and we'll have we'll allow living standards will go down, we'll be taxed more, we'll do whatever it takes, there'll be retrenchment in other areas of government activity to spend whatever we need to on this, and we will actually win, maybe not go into Iraq, concentrate on everything in Afghanistan. And that there it's happened. So it's good news for the Taliban, but the Taliban, they paid a very heavy price, over 100,000 Talibs killed over the past 20 years, and they might learn not to provoke the West now. So they got the country, it's in a relatively good state because there's been very little fighting recently, so they're not inheriting a pile of rubble like they did in the 90s. In some situations, in some ways they're in a much better situation they were in the 90s, because all their neighbours are willing to at least tolerate them. Nobody is inclined to fight the Taliban. Pakistan embraces them. Iran would rather get along with them. They dislike them. And the Central Asian republics likewise. China appears to be giving them their imprimatur. So if they behave themselves, they can get diplomatic recognition from more and more countries. Pakistan, the UAE and Saudi Arabia will probably do that anyway, as they did in the 90s. But if they have enough international recognition, when that reaches a critical mass of recognition by the sovereign states, there could be access to the IMF, there could be commerce, there could be loans and so on, embassies abroad, diplomatic passports, so that would be really good news for them. But maybe the Taliban's waiting till NATO is completely withdrawn, and then the real fun will begin, and maybe then they're going to go back to the 7th century AD, and there might be the sort of barbarity people witnessed in the 90s. But I think they've changed their spot somewhat. The world has moved forward. Even their sugar daddy Saudi Arabia has moved forward, allowing women to drive, allowing concerts and cinemas, which they hadn't allowed for 40 years, allowing men to vote in non-party elections, allowing tourism. So we are not as we were. So I know Trump is crowing about it, but this is his plan. If he was in charge, it would be happening on his watch. So Trump, if you believed in withdrawal, you could have withdrawn. You would have saved your country a lot of money, but he didn't do so. Is Biden had the moral courage to do the needful? There's no point in postponing the inevitable. It doesn't make any sense for Republicans to say, oh, well, what a bad thing to do. I mean, if they stayed another year, I don't see how it would have been any different. Now, NATO could say, well, you have to let people out of the airstrikes. Now they're roadblocks. The Taliban's trying to prevent people leaving because they realise they're losing their intelligentsia. Or maybe they also want to wreak vengeance on those who served their foes for many years. Anyway, so it's a ghastly situation. I do feel terribly sorry for the Afghans, but the world has really tried to discharge its responsibility to them for over 20 years. Mustn't forget the Taliban is fairly popular. It draws support from the Pashto-speaking community. They're about 40% of the population. Not all Pashto speakers back the Taliban, and there's some non-Pashto people who back them up. But anyway, so that's it. There are these vast crowds, and the throng could well stampede and just simply crush people. So it's very, very difficult. But thankfully, lots of people have been saved. I'm surprised there's only one flight every 45 minutes. So you have busy airports, there's one flight every minute coming in and out. And those military planes are sitting on the floor. Some of those are half empty. Well, that's enough for me. That's the latest from Kabul. Toodaloo.